Welcome to DNA Clarity and Support. I'm your host, Brian. Listen as I chat with authors and leaders in the DNA world about the family and personal impacts of DNA testing. You'll hear news stories, unique perspectives, find out about books, websites, organizations, other podcasts for those involved in the world of DNA. Please be sensitive to younger listeners as the conversations can get intense at times. This is a production of Watershed DNA. Learn more at watersheddDNA.com. Welcome today to this next episode of DNA Clarity and Support. My guest with me today is J.C. Kenney. Welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah. So this is a different type of interview in DNA book compared to what I've interviewed authors for in the past. And I'm excited to kind of get into what that means because you write mysteries. And specifically, we're going to talk about the fourth book in your series of mysteries about Allie Cobb. She's a young woman who inadvertently finds herself solving crimes in her small town in Indiana. And it's in your fourth book with Allie Cobb that we see DNA testing pop up for the first time. And it's in the course of solving a crime. So can you describe your Allie Cobb series in this book specifically and what cozy mysteries are and how they differ from other types of mysteries?
Yeah, so basically the Allie Cobb mysteries fall into what we refer to as cozy mysteries. By cozy mysteries, I mean think of something that is a small town, very comfortable. Normally, folks who read cozy mysteries like Murder, She Wrote on television or think of Agatha Christie. Now, my books in particular, the reason they fall into the cozy mystery genre is because my protagonist, Allie Cobb, is a literary agent by day. So solving crimes is not her regular gig. And so she's also a very independent single young woman. And so those are some of the hallmarks of the cozy mystery. And basically where my series came from is I live in Indianapolis and I love the area. So I got the idea to write a series set in the beautiful rolling hills of that area in a small tourist town that's Nashville, Indiana. And it's a cute little town. And so I came up with the pseudonym for the town called Rushing Creek, Indiana. And that's Allie's hometown. And that's where all of a sudden, out of the blue, like happens in cozy mysteries, murders stop popping up. And Allie takes it upon herself to help the police and try to get these crimes solved.
That's right, because she's not really a trained investigator and she's not a police officer. Like, that's not her day job. She's just like a literary agent, like you said. And in her free time, she's like off helping to solve crimes. And in your first three stories involving her, there are crimes that she's able to help solve, but without any DNA testing involved. And that's like most solving of crimes do not involve DNA samples and forensics. But in this fourth book, DNA testing comes in and it's different. It's not like forensic DNA specifically. So you want to talk a little bit about where DNA testing comes in this particular crime?
Yeah, so basically the fourth book in the series is called A Deadly Discovery. And to give you a little background on where I got the idea for this book, my wife is a genetic counselor like you are, Brian. And she, in addition to having a career in genetics, is also a big fan of genealogy. And so she spent a lot of time on Ancestry.com putting together our family trees and things like that. So the whole family tree genealogy kind of coming together has always been a big thing of interest in my family. And so what happened then a couple of years ago, a lot of folks, we started hearing about the Golden State Killer and how there was this crime that had been committed many, many years ago in California, or a number of crimes, I believe. And eventually the police and the authorities were able to use DNA evidence to solve that crime. So that's where I got an idea that, hey, I want to try that in my book because, my wife is a huge resource right here to make sure I get my facts straight, as well as you yourself. You provided me a ton of great info and I appreciate that. So the upshot of...
I'm really glad that you wove it into your story in a way that I think is not intimidating to people who don't know a lot about DNA. It's not like you went into super fine detail on all of the scientific ins and outs of forensics. It was really like, how did this work to help solve a crime at kind of the higher level?
Yeah, well, in the books that I write, they're the traditional whodunits. And so really the focus of the story and what people like to read about is figuring out, okay, well, the crime happens, but while that happens, that's not the major focus of the story. The focus of the story is the puzzle. How does Allie figure out, how does she come to find the clues, and what little tidbits does she find along the way during her investigation? And so what made this book an interesting challenge is because what I did is I made the crime a missing persons case that had gone unsolved for 20 years. And to a certain degree, most folks in the town had forgotten about the poor 18-year-old girl who had disappeared Christmas Eve at the turn of the millennium. And so it opened up the opportunity to kind of play with some ideas of, okay, how, if somebody disappeared 20 years ago, how could I use this interest in DNA and in, investigative genetic genealogy? That's kind of the fancy term for it. In solving basically a cold case, a missing persons case.
Yes. So in the other stories, it's crimes that are happening right at that time. But in this story, it's like you call it a cold case. So a case that's kind of been set aside, a file that's been put away, and it's not being investigated anymore. But because now of the changes in DNA testing and the ability to use some of the new databases to assist, reopen a cold case and take another look at it. So that's what's happening in reality, and then also in your story.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about this whole emerging field, is because it is providing folks who have lost loved ones and who have been left without answers for a long time, with the opportunity to maybe get some of those answers. And that's one of the themes I was able to explore in the book. What would it be like if one of our kids or our spouse or a close family member disappeared without a trace? And how would we cope for however long that is? And then to have an opportunity to have that mystery solved, how much would that mean to somebody? I think it would mean, just anything practically. So it was a very compelling idea. And I'm glad I was able to come up with a story that I hope gives the subject a fair shake and gives the whole idea justice.
I think it does. And for listeners who are not too familiar with DNA in the area of crime solving, so there's like government run databases like CODIS. And then there are genetic genealogy databases that are run either by DNA testing companies or third-party sites, like GenMatch is a well-known one for this area. So as you were writing the story, I'm sure you had to learn somewhat about the difference between the CODIS database that the government runs and the genetic genealogy databases. Is there something that you think listeners would benefit from learning, that you learned during the process of writing?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are, it's all very interesting to me. Most of it's way over my head, but I think a couple of things that are really interesting is for people to understand is that, for example, when perpetrators of violent crime are arrested and then incarcerated, oftentimes a DNA sample will be taken from them. And those are the samples that are stored into what you refer to as the government type of database. That way, investigators can look to see if this perpetrator has committed any other crimes along that same line. And, without getting too heavy into the subject matter, we're often talking rape, murder, some of those kind of really awful, awful crimes. So that's one thing I learned, is that that's kind of where the government database kind of figures in. And there's more than that, but for my purposes, that's what I learned. And then the private databases, that's where what I learned is that it's a whole separate animal, basically, from the government. And that's where folks like you and me, if we want to, we can get the private kind of cheek swab DNA test and find out if we have some long lost relatives. And it can be wonderful because folks find out, especially I can imagine someone who's maybe been adopted or has been estranged from a family member, they upload their information to this database that's shared with hundreds, if not thousands and millions of people. And then they can find familial connections, which can be really cool. And so those are the two big things that I found. And then what I was able to do was weave those two separate buckets, for lack of a better term, have them intertwine into solving the case. So it was a fun challenge.
So for listeners that have done DNA testing at a company like Ancestry or 23andMe, I wanted to stop for a minute and review where the databases are being used at times by investigators, because it's not all of these places. And where I go for my most current information, where I find links to information and questions answered, is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy's wiki. And that's where I went to review before we had our discussion today, because I wanted to make sure I was kind of up on what's happening right now, because this is all just developed since the year 2018. That's when some of these genealogy databases were used for the first time in solving crimes or identifying suspects in crimes. And there's two databases plus a third one that's kind of privately run that are being used. So if you've tested at FamilyTreeDNA and you've opted in your DNA kit, that can be used in matching to uploaded samples by investigators. And GenMatch is the second one. That's not a testing company, but it's a third-party site where if you've tested somewhere else, you can download your DNA file. It's just a computerized file of your DNA markers, and then upload it into GenMatch and opt in to this investigative genetic genealogy purpose. And then the third site is run by Othram, which is a company that's doing investigative genetic genealogy. And that one is separate from GenMatch and FamilyTreeDNA. So those are the only three databases that are being used for familial searches right now in terms of investigative genetic genealogy. So if you've tested at 23andMe and AncestryDNA or MyHeritage, you are not involved in this right now. That's just for clarification. So JC, do you have any heads up for readers before they get started reading? You think they should start with book 1 before they skip to book 4?
Well, I would love for everybody to, of course, start with book 1, because that is the book that introduces us to Allie, to her friends, to the community. And while all the books really, they are standalone. So if you wanted to read book 4 first, you could certainly do that. The thing with Cozy Mysteries, like my Allie Cobb mysteries, is that since they're a series, they are focused on this small community. It's a tight-knit group of folks that you get to learn more about with each book. So one of the things that happens with, and not just in cozy mystery, but a lot of different genres do this, is that if you jump in the middle of a series, you can still enjoy the story and the whodunit part, but you may not, be quite up to speed on some of the relationships and why some of the things happen in a book, that may have been, addressed in an earlier book, for example.
I know that you have a 5th book that just came out and are working on a 6th. Do either of those involve DNA?
No, they don't. It was really a fun challenge and a rewarding challenge to get into the DNA issue with book 4. But one of the things that I try to do with my mysteries is always come up with a different storyline, a different kind of murder. It's kind of a bizarre compulsion now that I have, looking at, I wonder how that could, mundane thing could be, woven into a murder mystery. So I don't know what it says about me, so I don't want to know. But unfortunately not with Allie. Allie's had her one turn at DNA. I will also throw out the caveat of never say never, because I did really, especially at the end of the book, I got a feeling of that I hopefully had written something that hopefully addresses some important, or at least talks about some important issues, about justice delayed, justice denied, some of those kind of things, and never forgetting people and how family is important and some of those things. So those are universal things. So who knows? Maybe we'll have a visit to DNA again sometime in the future.
I think never say never is a great rule to live by
Yeah.
in general.
Definitely.
So where should people look for a copy of the Allie Cobb series? Where would you recommend people go?
Well, they are available in ebook form at all the typical retailers. So, for example, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Nook, some of those kind of places. It's also available in print-on-demand format. So if you prefer to have a paperback instead of an ebook, you can get those either at barnesandnoble.com or go to Amazon. Unfortunately, the books are not available actually on bookshelves at your local retailer, but you can get it from the other more national sites.
Wonderful. And I will include information in the show notes about the book, where to find it, where to find the series.
Great.
And I'm looking forward to getting started with the next book in the series. I have read all 4 up to this point in time. I have the 5th one waiting for me on my Kindle. And then the 6th one will just, I'm just going to have to be patient with that one, I guess.
Yeah, the 6th one, I'm currently writing it right now, as a matter of fact, and it is due to my editor at the end of this year, so it should be out sometime early next year, February, sometime in the spring, maybe.
So 2022.
2022, you got it.
It was fun for me to read. I'm very familiar with Nashville, Indiana. I've spent many weekends there. I spent summers there as a child going to summer camp near Nashville, Indiana. And so it has a really warm, fuzzy feeling for me. So it was fun to read about and think about places that I could identify in the story with places I had been to in real life. So yeah. I'm glad that Nashville, Indiana has its own cozy mystery writer and hope that I can help people in that town enjoy them as well.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. That's one of the things where I think I'm very fortunate, living only an hour away from Nashville. My wife, Nancy, and I, will pop down there for a long weekend or just for a day trip. And it's like you said, it's just so cute and so much fun. And I can take pictures and say, oh, this would be perfect for this in the story. Or this would be perfect for that in the story. So it makes it a lot more fun that way to kind of say, okay, this is where in real life, this is where something, for example, where Allie lives, in the book. So yeah, it makes it a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of DNA Clarity and Support podcast. Head on over to watersheddDNA.com to learn more about the resources and support available for those involved in DNA discoveries.